Ever roll out of bed, step onto your lawn with your morning coffee, and feel like you just entered the Amazon? That was me a few weeks back. The ground was soaked, puddles everywhere, and the hose felt warm, like someone had just used it. Thing is, I live alone. No kids. No roommates. No tiny fairies stealing water for secret garden parties. Just me, my caffeine, and somehow a yard that hydrates itself. At first, I figured maybe the sprinkler system was on the fritz. Then it hit me. I don't even have sprinklers. Just one old hose. That's when the weird stuff started adding up. The water bill had skyrocketed. Not a small bump. It shot up like I'd been hosting nightly pool parties. But I wasn't. Only thing in the backyard was a dying tomato plant and my grill that hasn't worked since last summer. So where was all the water going? I started asking around. Most neighbors were chill, except one, Karen. Yep, her name was actually Karen. She'd moved in not long ago and started acting like she ran the block. Not the HOA president, but you'd never guess from the way she patrolled with her clipboard, inspecting lawns like a suburban sheriff. She'd complained about a neighbor's shutter color, told someone to mow their lawn tighter, and even scolded the mailman for parking too assertively near her mailbox. She was exhausting. Still, I didn't think she'd stoop to swiping water. Until I saw her. It was a Saturday. I'd just come back from grocery shopping, and pulling into my driveway, I caught her. There she was, floral blouse, giant sun hat, dragging my hose across the yard like it belonged to her. She hooked it up to a pressure washer and started blasting her porch. Like it was nothing. Didn't ask. Didn't care. Just helped herself in broad daylight like she owned the utility bill. I sat there in the car, stunned. She looked up, waved like we were brunch buddies, and said, "Hope you don't mind. Just a quick rinse." I didn't even have time to react. She turned around and kept spraying. I sat frozen, hands on the wheel, debating whether to call her out or just act like it didn't happen. I chose door number 2, walked inside, and stared at my faucet like it owed me answers. Later that day, I knocked on her door, calm and polite. Asked if she needed help with her water hookup or something. She laughed and said, "Oh no, I just like your hose better. The water pressure's incredible. Figured it's all community property anyway, right?" Community property. I nearly spat out my words. Last I checked, I wasn't living in a co-op and the water wasn't a gift from the heavens. I was footing the bill. I told her, calmly but clearly, that using my hose without asking wasn't cool. She smiled, tilted her head, and said, "Well, I'm sure the HOA won't mind. We're all supposed to share and be neighborly." And just like that, she closed the door. End of chat. Now here's the thing about me. I'm not into drama. I don't yell. I don't create scenes. I solve stuff. So I decided to go the official route. Emailed the HOA with photos. Explained everything, included my water bill, and asked what the deal was with this community property logic. A few days later, I got a reply. It read, and I quote, "Thank you for your concern. At this time, we encourage all neighbors to resolve minor disputes amicably without HOA intervention. Basically, handle it yourself." So I tried something else. Got a lock for the hose. Easy fix. No access. No problem. Crisis averted? Not even close. Next morning, the lock was gone. Not opened. Gone. Sliced clean. Someone had used bolt cutters. I stood there, staring at the chopped metal like I was on a crime scene show. I even checked for prints. Not that I'd know what to do if I found any. But deep down, I knew exactly who did it. And sure enough, across the street, there was Karen again, using the hose. Washing her SUV like she was filming a car ad. Water everywhere like it was free. Like it wasn't draining my bank account. I confronted her again. Less nice this time. Asked about the lock. She said, "Oh, that thing? It was a safety hazard. Could have tripped someone, so she handled it." Then she smiled, flipped her hair, and kept scrubbing her wheels. I was floored. Went back inside, sat on the couch, and stared at nothing for 10 solid minutes. The HOA wouldn't do a thing. Karen was untouchable, and somehow I ended up bankrolling her spa day for her house and car. That's when the idea hit me. Set up a camera. Nothing crazy, just a small, motion-triggered one tucked under the gutter near the faucet. If I couldn't stop her, maybe I could at least catch her in the act. Maybe then the HOA would finally pay attention. Or better yet, maybe I'd get something so outrageous the internet would handle her for me. Because if there's one thing folks online love, it's watching a shameless thief get caught in 4K. 2 days later, boom, there it was. Perfect footage. Karen sneaking into my yard like a cartoon crook, dragging the hose with that same smug smirk she wore every day. And the kicker? She used it to water her plants, fill up a kiddie pool, then gave her dog a bath. All before I'd even had my first cup of coffee. It was a full-blown Karen show, and I had it all on tape. I posted a clip to a local neighborhood forum with the title, "Neighbor Steals My Water Every Morning." The video blew up. People were shocked. Some cracked jokes. Others shared advice. One guy even linked me to a motion-activated sprinkler to blast trespassers. But the best part? Karen saw it. I knew she did because the next morning, she was banging on my door. No sun hat. No phony smile. Just pure rage. She said I was invading her privacy, ruining her reputation, and making the neighborhood hostile. I told her she was trespassing, stealing my water, and costing me money. She scoffed, folded her arms, and hit me with the dumbest line I've ever heard. Do something about it. I dare you. That's when everything changed. That dare lit a fire I didn't even know I had. Because yeah, I was going to do something. Something she'd never see coming. Something she'd never forget. If Karen wanted water, well, she was about to get it. The next morning, I woke up with a new attitude. No more being the friendly neighbor. No more HOA emails. No more padlocks. Karen threw down the challenge, and I was picking it up. I was about to make her think twice every time she touched a faucet. But revenge needs strategy, and I wasn't jumping in blind. First, I wanted to see how far she'd actually go. Was it only when I wasn't home? Or was she gutsy enough to do it any time? I took a day off, stayed inside with the blinds shut and a mug of coffee, just watching. And right on cue, around 10:30 a.m., I heard the soft hiss of the spigot turning and the hose dragging. I peeked through the blinds. There she was again, in yoga pants and that smug look, casually hosing down her driveway like it was her personal car wash. This time, I stepped outside with my phone, pretending to text. She saw me, paused a second, then kept going like I wasn't even there. I didn't say a word, just hit record. She didn't flinch, like she wanted to prove I couldn't stop her. That my complaints, my camera, my warnings, none of it mattered. When she finished, she waved the hose at me and said, "See? Works great. You should thank me for keeping it in shape." I faked a smile, went back inside, and watched the footage again. Didn't even need to zoom. It was crisp, direct, and totally incriminating. But I already knew the HOA wouldn't lift a finger. Been down that road. Time for a different kind of justice. That afternoon, I uploaded the new clip to a neighborhood Facebook group, this time with a flashier title, "Local Karen Turns Neighbor's Hose into Personal Water Park." Within hours, the comments were flooding in. Everyone had a Karen story, but mine struck a chord. People laughed, roasted her, threw out wild punishments, even dropped some legal tips. Plenty were pissed the HOA hadn't done squat. The video kept spreading, past the group, onto Reddit. Then YouTube. People from across the country were tagging their friends. And Karen? Oh, she noticed. The next morning, she was in her yard with 2 HOA board members, pointing toward my house. I watched through the window as she played the poor victim. Big gestures, even fake crying. A few hours later, I found a letter in my mailbox. An official warning from the HOA about unauthorized surveillance and creating a hostile environment. I almost laughed out loud. Hostile? I hadn't even raised my voice. They cared more about me recording her theft than the theft itself. That was it. I was through playing fair. If the system wouldn't back me up, I'd build my own. I started making plans. I thought about alarms, bogus warnings, practical jokes. But none of it felt right. I wanted something that hit different. Something with flair. Something that wouldn't just cause chaos, but would leave a lasting memory. That's when fate handed me the perfect setup. I was driving past a construction zone at the edge of our neighborhood and saw a crew putting up a temporary sewage tank. Not your everyday kind either. This one was heavy duty, the kind meant for portable restrooms and waste storage. And then it clicked. A disgusting, clever, absolutely satisfying plan. I pulled over and started chatting with one of the guys on site, asked a few casual questions, said I was a homeowner running into some drainage issues and thinking about using a similar tank for a backyard irrigation experiment. He laughed it off, but was cool about it, and after some back and forth, I slipped him some cash to borrow the tank for one evening, strictly for testing. He agreed, gave a shrug, and told me as long as I didn't mess with the pump, he didn't care what I did. That was all I needed. Back at my place, I grabbed my tools, built a little adapter that let me hook up a second hose to the tank spigot, then buried it underground and behind some bushes, directly connected to the sewage tank. It was perfect. From the outside, the hose looked completely normal. But once someone turned it on, expecting clean, pressurized water, they were in for one nasty surprise. A stinky, murky, unforgettable surprise. I tested it once with a separate hose and a sealed bucket. The results were everything I hoped for. Just the stench could have floored a grown man. All I had to do was wait. That night, under the cover of darkness, I got everything in place, checked that the cameras were ready, and left the main hose exactly where Karen always found it. The bait was perfect. The trap was set. And sure enough, the next morning around 10:30, I heard it. That familiar hiss from the hose. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. There she was, dragging the hose across her yard like she owned the place. Didn't even check her surroundings. That's how sure she was. That entitled. She hooked the hose to one of those fancy rotating sprinklers and placed it in the middle of her lawn. Then she turned the valve. At first, just a slow gurgle. A weird sputtering noise. She tilted her head, confused. Then it happened. A burst of thick, dark, reeking liquid shot out in a wide arc, soaking her yard, her patio, and, best of all, her white wicker patio set. The sprinkler did one rotation, then another. By the third spin, she was shrieking. Shrieking so loud I could hear her through the walls. She sprinted toward the valve, slipping across her yard as it turned into a nasty swamp. Neighbors started poking their heads out. Some gasped. One guy dropped his mug. Someone even started recording. Karen battled with the hose like it was alive. She yanked it off the sprinkler, but not before one last jet of sewage blasted her legs. She was drenched, screaming, gagging. And the best part? Witnesses. Real people who saw it all happen. I watched it all unfold on my screen, relishing every second. This wasn't just payback. This was performance. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside pretending to grab my mail. She spotted me and came charging over. Still in ruined sandals, covered in filth, yelling about lawsuits and health codes and threats. I didn't say a word, just smiled and said, "You told me to handle it." So I did. Her face went red, then green, then red again. She stormed off, ranting about the HOA. I waved and said, "Be sure to mention this time the water wasn't stolen." That night, I uploaded the footage. And within hours, it exploded online. Karen was viral, in the worst way possible. By morning, the whole neighborhood felt different. People weren't just whispering anymore. They were openly laughing. The moment Karen's sewage sprinkler stunt hit the internet, her image tanked so fast it might have cracked concrete. The video caught fire, especially after someone edited it with dramatic music and slow-motion zooms of her reaction. I didn't even post it this time. Somebody else did, probably one of the neighbors who caught it live. The angle showed it was from the upper balcony across the street. Within half a day, the clip was on Reddit, TikTok, even Facebook mom groups with titles like "When Karens Get Owned" and "Local Karma in Action." And as great as the reactions were, I wasn't finished. See, the sewage stunt was just step one. It was flawless, no question. But Karen wasn't the type to take a hint. If anything, the disaster only kicked her need for revenge into overdrive. I knew the silence wouldn't stick. And sure enough, that afternoon, a super official envelope landed on my doorstep. Inside was a letter in full caps, stuffed with legal jargon and baseless threats. She accused me of deliberate sabotage, putting her in danger, and even biological assault. She claimed her dog got sick from the incident, even though I had clear footage showing the pup nowhere near the spray zone. I almost felt sorry for whatever lawyer wrote that, if she even hired one, because anyone reading the real story would have burst out laughing. Still, the letter did confirm one thing for me. Karen wasn't backing down. So I kicked off phase 2. Not another prank. Something sharper, something final. A complete takedown. First step? Boost my camera setup. I added 2 more motion-activated cams along the side of the house, and one hidden right above the hose, tucked into a fake birdhouse. I wanted full coverage, 360 degrees, just in case she got crafty. Then I swung by the construction site again to thank the crew and casually offer to send over some pizza on me. Keeping them happy meant keeping access to the sewage tank a bit longer. They thought I was testing some kind of fertilizer flow. I didn't correct them. Back home, I upgraded the hose rig. The first version needed hands-on setup and timing. This time, I installed a remote switch inside my garage. It controlled a valve splitter that flipped between normal water and the sewage tank line. Totally seamless, buried underground, with fresh grass covering it. Maybe overkill, but I wasn't leaving anything to chance. If Karen dared to mess with it again, she'd never know which water line she was tapping into. Like hose roulette. But then came a twist I didn't see coming. Karen disappeared. Not completely. She was still in her house across the street, but she wasn't coming out. For 2 days, her blinds stayed closed. Her car didn't move. Her lawn looked untouched. No hose action. No shouting. No clipboards. It felt eerie, like the quiet before a storm. And on day 3, the storm hit. A letter from the HOA showed up at my door. Not a warning. A fine. A real one. It said I had violated community health rules and purposely created a hazardous situation for another resident. The amount? $600. I stared at it, stunned. I called the HOA office, demanded some answers, and got bounced around 3 different board members. Finally, someone admitted Karen had filed an official complaint, with photos and 2 so-called witnesses claiming I threatened her with a chemical attack. I couldn't even laugh. It was ridiculous. I offered to hand over all the camera footage, with timestamps and even records from the construction crew showing the hose never left my property. They said they'd look into it at the next board meeting, which, by the way, wasn't for another month. Classic setup. Karen knew exactly how the HOA worked. Slow-moving, full of red tape, easy to manipulate. She was using it like her personal armor. But she slipped up. She thought I'd roll over, that I'd pay the fine or sit quiet while things got sorted. She didn't realize that while she was hiding behind paperwork, I was already digging into the rules. Over the next few days, I did my homework. Searched through public documents, read every HOA bylaw, even made a trip to the county clerk's office. It wasn't about being obsessed. It was about being precise. And that's when I found it. A clause buried in Section 4.12b of the HOA rules. Any homeowner caught entering another resident's property without permission, especially to use utilities, would face an immediate probe, fines, and possible removal from HOA privileges. Bingo. That was it. Karen had been on my property countless times. I had video. I had timestamps. I had real witnesses, not imaginary ones. I printed everything out, stapled it into a thick file, and sent copies to the HOA and a few neighbors who'd also had issues with her. I wasn't launching a war. I started a movement. 2 days later, one of my neighbors showed up. A quiet guy named Glenn who lived 2 doors down. Said he'd been fed up with Karen since she complained about his hammock being too bright. He thanked me for speaking up. Then another neighbor joined. Then another. Turns out, Karen had made enemies all over the block. I just gave them a reason to speak up. Soon, the whole street was buzzing. People were swapping stories, trading evidence, and sharing clips like they were collectibles. I didn't have to do another thing. Karen had ruled the neighborhood like a queen for months, and now her kingdom was rising up. The last piece clicked into place when someone leaked an audio recording from a closed-door HOA meeting where Karen had tried to sway the board. Her voice was instantly recognizable, full of that same entitled tone. It ended with her yelling about being the victim of envious neighbors who couldn't handle a confident woman. That clip, along with the sewage shower video, caused the perfect storm. 2 days later, Karen came outside wearing sunglasses, no makeup, clearly rattled. She didn't yell. She didn't swipe water. She simply got in her car and drove off without acknowledging anyone. For the first time in weeks, the block felt still, peaceful, like before she showed up. But I wasn't naive enough to believe it was done. People like Karen don't just vanish. They regroup, re-strategize, and launch a counterattack. That's why I left the remote valve switch armed. That's why I kept the surveillance running nonstop. If she ever made another move, I'd be set. Because this wasn't only about the water anymore. This was about drawing the line. And Karen had finally realized that mine came with fallout. 3 days passed in an unsettling kind of quiet. Her house sat frozen, like it was on lockdown. No vehicles out front. No music on the porch. No hose sneaking onto my grass like a silent thief. It felt almost too quiet, like a setup. I knew her well enough by now to see she wasn't just sulking and letting go. She was the kind who didn't let up, not out of courage, but because surrendering control wasn't in her nature. And after that sprinkler debacle, she'd lost everything. Her pride, her pristine patio, her throne as queen of the cul-de-sac. So when I heard the knock a little past noon, I didn't even flinch. I already knew it'd be her. What I didn't see coming was the backup she brought. Standing beside her on my porch were two HOA board members, one clutching a clipboard, the other holding a bulky folder. Karen, dressed like she was on a courtroom set, arms crossed, jaw locked, eyes locked onto mine like she was running lines for her big win. Clipboard guy cleared his throat and said they were there to talk about a growing property issue and a potential biohazard matter. I asked if they wanted to come in, but Karen snapped that she didn't feel safe in my house. I chuckled to myself, quietly, because I saw right through it. This was her final act, trying to paint herself as the wounded party. They handed over a formal complaint, 3 pages of dramatic phrasing. Karen said I'd weaponized sewage, created an environmental threat, and caused her emotional trauma from what she described as a planned public shaming campaign. She even claimed the smell had soaked into her home's foundation, which made me wonder if she had any clue how pipes work. I let them speak, nodding now and then, waiting for the part one knew was coming. And then it came. Karen said I needed to cover the cost of cleaning her yard and patio, issue a formal apology, and attend an HOA-arranged mediation. As soon as she wrapped up her absurd list, I held up a finger and said I had something to show them. I stepped inside, grabbed my evidence binder, and brought it out. It had everything. Time-stamped footage of Karen entering my property without consent, repeatedly, always holding my hose. I included my water bills, neighborhood forum screenshots, and a list of other residents who had filed complaints about her over the past year. I even highlighted the specific HOA bylaw she broke, in bright yellow. Unauthorized use of private utilities with trespassing. Clipboard guy took his time reading. Karen's face went ghost white as he flipped page after page. The other board member leaned in and whispered something, and suddenly the vibe shifted. Karen began interrupting, saying the videos were fake, that I was watching her, that I'd been hostile way before the HOA ever stepped in. But the board wasn't buying it. They said they'd need time to look through everything and would hold a special meeting later in the week. Karen objected, said she needed a fast resolution. But this time, they didn't respond. As they turned to leave, Karen faced me one last time. Her voice was low now, shakier, sharper. She told me she'd make sure everyone saw who I truly was. I told her they already did. And just like that, she stormed off, mumbling something I didn't bother to catch. That night, I posted a straightforward, factual summary in the same neighborhood forum where the videos had gone viral. No snark, no over-the-top takes. Just the facts. How she trespassed, stole water, how I tried working through the HOA, and how I took steps to protect my home when that failed. The response was massive. People backed me up, shared more Karen run-ins. One neighbor even offered to mow my lawn just to say thanks for taking a stand. Someone else left a homemade pie at my door with a sticky note that said, "You're a legend." 2 days later, the special HOA meeting was held. It wasn't open to residents, but news traveled fast. Karen showed up armed with printed documents and a folder she said contained legal threats aimed at her. But all of it fell apart when the facts came to light. The board watched my footage, checked the HOA rules, and gave her an official warning. She was fined $500 for several counts of trespassing and told that if it happened again, she'd lose her HOA privileges. No one offered me an apology, but it was clear they were pulling away from their earlier support of her. She had finally become too much trouble. And the best part? Her little cheer squad started to crumble. The board member who once backed her quietly stepped down the following week. Karen, who used to strut around like the neighborhood cop, now kept her eyes on the ground while walking her dog. Her driveway stayed bone dry. Her porch stayed messy. And the hose? She never touched it again. But that wasn't the end of it. Karen made one more desperate attempt. She filed a complaint with the city, claiming I had illegally hooked up a sewage line in my yard. A city inspector showed up, checked everything, and after laughing for 5 minutes straight, said there was nothing wrong. The hose line wasn't permanent. No code violation. He even told me off the record that he wished more folks got creative like that. I offered him a bottle of water. He smiled and said, "Only if it's not from the hose." By then, my video had passed 4 million views. People started reaching out for interviews. One guy emailed to ask if I'd sell shirts with the phrase "Hose Justice" on them. Neighbors started treating me like a local legend, but I didn't feel like one. I just felt relief. After weeks of craziness, things were calm. Still, a part of me stayed on alert. Because people like Karen don't just vanish. They regroup. They plan. They look for a new angle. so I left the remote valve in place. I kept the cameras rolling. I even installed a new hose, bright, shiny, coiled perfectly like bait. Not because I thought she'd try again, but if she did, I wanted to be ready. Because now everyone in the neighborhood knew one thing. If Karen came for my hose again, she better bring a mop. Nearly a month had passed since the sewage storm hit Karen's castle. Her home, once ground zero for drama, gossip, and passive-aggressive notes, now sat like a relic of petty dictatorship. The porch light stayed off, curtains drawn tight, and not once did her feet cross onto my yard again. The hose lay still and shiny under the sun, like a retired soldier resting after battle. For the first time in ages, my mornings were peaceful. No more surprise hikes in the water bill, no more arguments over a hose, no more feeling like a trespasser on my own property. Life had finally gone back to normal, or at least something close to it. Neighbors didn't just nod anymore. They smiled and waved. People who used to avoid her started stopping by to chat with me. Glenn, the guy with the hammock, invited me to a backyard cookout, and someone anonymously dropped off a gold-painted hose nozzle at my door like a trophy. No note, no name, just a silent shout-out from someone who got it. Online, the story took on a life of its own. The video kept spreading, memes popped up, and people shared their own Karen tales in response. One guy made a parody song with slow-motion clips of the sewage spray, set to dramatic opera. Someone else made an animated retelling in comic book style, with exaggerated cartoon versions of Karen and me. Every few days, I got messages from strangers thanking me for standing up to HOA nonsense, or saying my story gave them courage to challenge their own local tyrants. I hadn't asked for the attention, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. Still, I never completely relaxed. Karen had gone silent, but silent didn't mean finished. It meant plotting. One night, just after sundown, I found an envelope under my front door. No stamp, no sender, just a neatly folded sheet inside. The handwritten message said, "You may have won this time, but this neighborhood won't be yours forever. I'll be back stronger." The handwriting was unmistakable. I'd seen that same angry script on every HOA complaint she'd ever filed. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so her. Dramatic, vague, and totally useless. The next day, a moving truck pulled up to her place. No heads up, no farewells. Just movers loading up potted plants, patio chairs, and that hideous pink flamingo by the mailbox. She didn't say a word to anyone. She just disappeared. Her house was up for sale by the end of the week, and not long after, a young couple with a toddler moved in. They introduced themselves right away, brought over some cookies, and asked nicely if they could use their own hose hookup. I almost teared up. It felt so refreshingly normal. But that wasn't the end of it. A week later, I got an email from a guy named Devin. He lived in another HOA across town and had somehow ended up with Karen as his new next-door neighbor. Turns out, she didn't waste a second falling back into her old routine. First, it was whining about someone's wind chimes being too noisy, then freaking out over a cat that dared walk across her porch, and finally, brace yourself, she was caught dragging a neighbor's hose through the yard to wash her car. Devin found me because of the viral video and asked if I had any advice on dealing with her. I gave him everything I had. I sent him the schematics for the valve setup, listed out the camera brands I used, and even shared a file I'd made called the Karen Defense Protocol. He wrote back with just 3 words, "This means war." I didn't hear from him for a bit, but when I did, it was epic. Devin took my plan and ran with it. Instead of sewage, he went with a mix of compost tea and expired fertilizer, totally organic, but outrageously nasty. Karen got sprayed again, except this time it happened in front of a bunch of kids riding their scooters. The video wasn't as clear as mine, but it was comedy gold. She shrieked, slipped, and landed face-first in her landscaping. The footage hit the internet, and within 2 days, folks were calling it Karen's Revenge Part 2. The saga rolled on, and I realized something equal parts funny and terrifying. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a mobile circus of entitlement, spreading drama in every HOA she joined. But now, with the internet on our side, every time she acted up, someone was ready to clap back. That's when I figured I might as well make something of the whole mess. I started a blog where I wrote about ridiculous HOA stories, neighborhood drama, and suburban absurdities. I never named names, but everyone knew who the hose queen was. I turned the camera footage into a short mini-series, mixing in anonymous stories that others sent in. It blew up faster than I thought. People were fed up with being bossed around in their own neighborhoods, and somehow, my goofy hose saga had become their rallying cry. I even started selling a few shirts with jokes like hose before brothers and justice flows. But honestly, the best part of the whole thing wasn't the views or the comments or even watching Karen wipe out in her own karma. It was something simpler. One afternoon, I was trimming the hedges in my backyard when I heard laughter. Big, genuine, carefree laughter. It was the new couple who had moved into Karen's old place, chasing their toddler around a sprinkler they'd hooked up to their own hose in their own yard. The kid was giggling, the parents were cracking up, and no one was stealing water or threatening fines. That was the real win. Not the revenge. Not the internet fame. Just peace. A neighborhood where people respected boundaries again. Where hoses sprayed water, not drama. As I stood there holding my hose, I thought about all the nonsense one cheap piece of plastic had stirred up. Who would have guessed a garden hose could bring down a neighborhood tyrant and unite a bunch of strangers? It was absurd. It was poetic. And it was just right. I twisted the spigot, let the water flow, and gave my tomato plant a drink the way I used to. Calm, quiet, and with no one watching. And for the first time in ages, it actually felt like home.